Live from the Washington, D.C. area, it's the Inside Scoop. All the news that our viewers want to know. Now, here's the host.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Deborah Woolen, and I'm your host this evening for Inside Scoop. Did you know that 10% of Virginians and 10% of Fairfax County residents are living in poverty? Well, tonight we have with us Valerie LaRue, who's the Deputy Director of the Virginia Poverty Law Center, and we're going to talk about why we need to pay attention to our citizens and our neighbors that are living in poverty and what we can do to help them. So Valerie, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Yes.
Happy to be here.
Great, thank you. So before we get into the Virginia Poverty Law Center and all the initiatives going on there, tell us about yourself. How did you get to VPLC?
So I went to law school sort of later in life. My son was about 5 when I went to law school, and I had been working for the State Coalition of Sexual Assault Crisis Centers. I was doing a lot of policy work, and that made me get inspired to go to law school and study policy.
Wow. And then so I guess from what experiences made you say, hey, I really want to focus in on poverty law, or what was it?
Well, I always knew I wanted to work on public interest kinds of work because I was really passionate about a lot of different things that impact low-income people, the environment, things like that. So I wasn't 100% sure what I wanted to do when I went to law school. I just knew that I wanted to work in public policy so I could make changes that would positively impact people. And so my first summer, I interned at a public defender office. And so when I graduated from law school, I actually became a public defender, and I did that for almost 7 years. But I really felt called to that as kind of like, you help one person at a time. But you can see how terrible the system is and how interconnected it is and how so many different things impact low-income people and make it really hard for them to ever escape the cycle of poverty that our society puts them in. And so I really wanted to do policy work, again, focusing on the issues that I saw as being really important, and that led me eventually to Virginia Poverty Law Center. And I am the Deputy Director of the Center for Family Advocacy within Virginia Poverty Law Center, so I focus on family issues.
Gotcha, and we are going to get into the interconnectedness of poverty and law and policy. But let's talk a bit about specifically VPLC, like what branches are there within the organization?
Yeah, so we have been around since 1978, so for around 45 years, and during that time we have just focused on civil legal issues that impact low-income people. And as we've sort of understood how interconnected all these things are, we have sort of expanded a lot of the things that we do, but it's always based on that issue of the needs of low-income people in the civil legal arena. And so we do a lot of different things. We focus on, one of the biggest things actually we've been focusing on in the past few years is the rate of evictions, which in Virginia is very high. Virginia has 5 of the top cities for the worst rate of evictions in the US. And so that has become really important, especially post-pandemic. And so that's a big thing that we work on. The issue of predatory loans is a big thing. Issue of what happens to low-income seniors, public assistance like SNAP, TANF, Medicaid, utility affordability. A lot of people, when their utility gets shut off, that can begin a cascade to losing a lot of other things. We operate a number of helplines. We have people to help people get enrolled in either Medicaid or one of the marketplace health insurance plans all throughout Virginia. So we work on a statewide level, and we just work on all these issues that affect low-income people. We work on domestic violence issues. We work on public assistance. We work on unemployment. There's so many different things that when we see sort of a need that has arisen, then we figure out how to address it.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many branches of VPLC. So as you mentioned, consumer advocacy, domestic and sexual violence, elder law, family and child welfare, health law, housing advocacy, immigration, legislative policy, utility fairness. So you all really touch everything. How many, just off the top of your head, like how many employees or
We're around 30 now. And when I started, it was probably
30?
around... Yes, yes.
Wow.
When I started about 7 years ago, we were about half that.
Oh my gosh.
And we've grown because people have seen the effectiveness of our work and have wanted to support it. And so we have been given grants to work on specific issues like the eviction helpline, so you mentioned immigration. We don't do immigration law, but we have a program called La Vida that helps people who are victims of domestic violence to apply for the specific visas that are available to certain people who are victims of crime or victims of domestic violence. So just a very specific, narrow area that we work in there. But we've also, because of lawsuits that we've undertaken on behalf of low-income people, we have also been able to get some awards that way, for instance, for predatory loans. We have helped sue predatory lenders on behalf of low-income people to help them get their money back and things like that. So as people have seen some of the work we do and how effective we've been, it's made them want to support us more.
Absolutely. And so, yeah, we definitely are going to get into predatory lending and your organization's help in that area. But gosh, just 30 people, I imagine the workload is overwhelming.
It really can be. There are certain times of the year when, we're definitely working, late hours and things like that. So it can be.
That's interesting. A certain time of the year, is it like during holiday season or the summer more than the winter, or?
Well, a lot of what
election
we do.
Season.
Well, we don't work on elections. We are a nonpartisan organization. We work with legislators on both sides of the aisle. We work with every kind of administration. And so we're just very narrowly focused on what will help low-income people. And we don't care who it is that can be part of our coalition of bringing people together to work on those issues. What's important is that people in Virginia get the help they need and get laws that don't keep them, behind the 8 ball, which a lot of our laws do. Sure. So, but during the General Assembly, which begins in January and goes typically through March, that is our busiest time because we generally, most of us at VPLC are in the General Assembly building every single day. And sometimes we're there from 6 a.m. until 10 p.m. There's committee meetings all day long, and we are there to speak for and against bills that impact the civil legal needs of low-income people. And so that's a big part of what we do. As we get ready for the General Assembly, we're talking to legislators about the legislative agenda. And a lot of times they seek us out, asking us for help, and they say, oh, here's something I want to be able to do. You're the experts in this area. How can we do that? Can you help me figure out how to, get this accomplished? So we work with, like I said, we work with legislators of every political stripe to make that happen.
Sure. So there's no way that we can talk about, or within my mind, talk about poverty and the legislation without talking about the debt ceiling crisis or issue happening right now within the U.S. So specifically, TANF, which is Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, and SNAP, or most people might know that as food stamps or an EBT card. So from what I've been reading, that's been one of the kind of, what's the word that I want to use? Maybe, I can't think of the word right now, but just something that, a compromising tool within the the debt ceiling package. So what is your perspective, or what are your thoughts on that, like Americans that are going to be affected?
It makes me both sad and angry to think that poor people become a bargaining chip in our society. And that is really a travesty. We should not be using people's lives as a bargaining chip. And, the work requirements that are being added to SNAP, for instance, first of all, most of those low-income people do work. There's a sense in our society, and this is of long standing, we didn't invent it, but I think we're sort of worse at it than a lot of other countries, that poor people must be lazy. And that if we give them some kind of financial support, well, by golly, they better deserve it and they better work for it. And that's really not true. Poor people generally work much harder than everyone else. They have to just to survive. A lot of times they're working 2 or 3 part-time, low-wage jobs. And in order to get to those jobs, they are taking 3 buses, or getting different people to give them a ride to work, or taking one of those scooters that you trip over on the street. The low-income people are just working really, really hard, much harder than any of the rest of us, actually. And so instead of like adding insult to injury to say, oh, well, if you want to get any SNAP, then you have to prove that you're working. So sometimes people who are getting SNAP are mothers, and just taking care of their kids might be working enough. You know, if you were a middle-class mom, you might say, oh, I'm going to stay home and take care of my kids. And if someone says, oh, well, that's not a real job, they'll be pretty pissed off at you and say, what do you mean? Taking care of kids is a full-time job. But if you're poor, you're not allowed to have that as your full-time job. The other thing is that it's really silly because administering work requirements is very costly. You have to hire a lot of people in state government, and state government is having a really hard time finding people to hire. Virginia just decided to do away with a lot of degree requirements for jobs because they can't find enough people who want to take those jobs at the rates that they're willing to pay. And so how are we going to find all these people? The city of Richmond, where I live right now, is experiencing a huge crisis because most of the positions in the Department of Social Services are empty. Wow. So they don't even have people to answer the phone when you call and say, I need food stamps. So who is going to be the person who makes sure that the food stamp recipient has a job? Nobody, because there's nobody there. Sure. There's no there at the Virginia Department of Social Services in Richmond. So that has been, very frustrating for people that we serve. They call our helplines and ask for help. We try to call on their behalf, and it's been, reported on in the news multiple times. There was a hearing about it in the General Assembly recently. But these are issues where if you require people to work, then somebody has to make sure that they're doing that work. And and if they get a new job, which low-income people cycle through jobs very often. They might have a job that pays $11.50 today, and then tomorrow they may get a job that pays $12 an hour, and they're going to leave that $11.50 an hour job for that $12 an hour because 50 cents is a lot when you're poor. And so now what they have to do is they have to go, oh, I need to notify the SNAP person that I changed jobs. So what are they going to do? They're going to call the office and say, oh, I changed jobs, and nobody's going to answer the phone. Gosh. And so 6 months down the road, someone's going to say, oh, we checked to verify your employment, and you're no longer employed at this job that you said you had that paid $11.50 an hour 6 months ago, so we're going to discontinue your SNAP. And then the person's going to have to apply all over again. So this is really inefficient. It is inefficient. In addition to harming poor people, it's super inefficient, and it's something that we shouldn't have done.
Absolutely. So please make sure you come back as we continue our conversation with Valerie LaRue, who is the Deputy Director of the Virginia Poverty Law Center's Center for Family Advocacy. This is such an important conversation to understand why we need to care about our neighbors who are experiencing poverty. We'll be right back.
It's a beautiful day out here, sunny today with light breezes, giving way to clouds in the afternoon. We could see some light precipitation to moderate precipitation later on, followed by powerful storm-like conditions. 90 miles per hour winds are expected. Authorities are asking everyone, stay indoors. Come on, that's it, let's go.
Oh, Dad, wait till you see the bike we got for Jake.
Hearing loss happens gradually with age, making it easy to ignore. Yet most older Americans aren't getting their hearing tested. Untreated hearing loss can keep your loved ones from enjoying what they cherish most.
Dad, can you hear me?
Don't let that happen. Speak up about hearing loss. You'll be glad you did.
You can't buy a best friend. You can love them, pet them, care for them, whether they want you to or not. You can take a picture, you can jump, yell, you can fly to the moon, travel the world, or just stay in bed. You can't buy a best friend like that, but you can adopt one. 'Cause we're connected.
Cook foods to the right temperature using a food thermometer. 3,000 Americans will die from food poisoning this year. Keep your family safer. Check your steps at foodsafety.gov.
we're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Thank you so much for coming back and joining us on Inside Scoop as we continue our conversation with Valerie LaRue. So Valerie, when we left off, we were talking about just the impacts of poverty on families within our state and Fairfax County. One thing that we were talking about before the show, which I think is a perfect segue into our second segment, which is where we're going to talk about family and child welfare. But you mentioned before the show how that's what we were talking about. We were talking about minimum wage. And before the show, we were saying that a $1 increase in minimum wage can contribute to a 10% decrease in phone calls to CPS, or Child Protective Services. And then we also talked about how a 1% increase in evictions contributes to a 1.6 increase in foster care. So again, just going back to that interconnectedness that we talked about in the previous segment, that's just such a perfect example of how everything touches each other. So I know you are specifically, again, the Deputy Director for Family Advocacy. So just talk about your work in that area.
Yeah, sure. So the Center for Family Advocacy works on domestic violence issues, sexual violence issues, family law, custody, child support, all of those things, and child welfare. And child welfare means CPS, foster care, all of those sort of related issues. And in Virginia, like in most of the country, the majority of children in foster care come from poor families. And the main reason for that is because they're poor. And there are a lot of interconnecting things that cause that to happen. So one of them is, like you said, just being low income in and of itself can be a stressor that makes it more likely that someone will come to the attention of CPS. And it can also make it more likely that they have problems in their lives that can lead to CPS involvement. So one of those things might just be family stress generally. It also might be that the children, aren't getting a good variety of food because we're not doing a good job of providing SNAP benefits. It can mean that they end up with dirty or ill-fitting clothes. And it can mean things like parents not having childcare. It can mean things like parents having their utilities shut off. And all of these things can lead to children coming to the attention of CPS so that investigations might happen. And one time a kid who was in foster care said, the reason why I came into foster care was because my mom was having a really hard time supporting us. And so I was sent to live with the foster family. And they gave the foster family lots and lots of money to take care of me. But if they'd given that money to my mom, then I could have stayed home with my mom. And those foster kids are so incredibly astute. They see exactly what's happening. And when they see things like that, it makes them pretty angry, understandably so, that they couldn't stay with the person they loved and who loved them because they were poor. And so yes, housing instability is one of the reasons why children can come into foster care. A lot of times people think, oh, well, when CPS investigates a family, it's because the family has been abusive, and children come into foster care because of abuse, and they imagine just terribly abusive situations. But actually, the vast majority of children come into foster care due to what's called neglect, and neglect often is what's considered poverty-adjacent neglect, and those can be the things that I discussed, things like not having high-quality food, not having clean, well-fitting clothes, not having good childcare, being stressed, not having access to mental health services, things like that. And even things like some of the programs that we have for kids, the medical care that we have for kids, it can be really hard to get a doctor's appointment if the only insurance you have is Medicaid. And so a lot of the doctors who take Medicaid have very long waiting lists, and so getting a sick child to the doctor can result in things like multiple visits to the doctor, which means, or being sick longer, which means missing days of school, and then the teacher could call CPS because the child hasn't shown up in school. There's a lot of things like that that are interconnected that lead to a lot of the entries into child welfare. And because of some of the structural inequities in our society, it's often more likely that families of color are going to be living in poverty. But even given that, children of color are much more represented in the child welfare system than our white children. So as an example, I looked at the statistics before I came here today.
Sure.
So Fairfax, the population of Fairfax is 10% Black, but 37% of the kids in foster care, so more than 3 times as much in Fairfax, are Black. Now you're better than Arlington, also 10% Black population, but in Arlington you've got 52% of the kids in foster care are Black. And that's not only because of the structural issues that lead to Black families more likely to be living in poverty, but also because of what we call over-policing. And there's a wonderful book. If anyone is really interested in these issues, I would really recommend that you read the book Shattered Bonds by Professor Dorothy Roberts. That's an amazing book. It will have you in tears. Your jaw will be on the floor when you read this book. But it really talks about these structural issues, how they impact low-income families, how they especially have an impact on low-income Black families and other families of color. You know, we've been hearing more and more about what happened to American Indian families when their children were removed to put them in these schools that were really not schools, where many of them ran away and were never heard from again, who died there on the site. Their families never saw them again. But some of them tried to go back to their families, but when they went back, they were so disconnected from their culture, it was very hard, they really struggled. And that's part of the reason why American Indian communities often struggle with things like alcoholism and things like that. And we see some of the same things in the African American communities. Because of that higher rate of entry into foster care, a lot of Black families are discontinuous. They no longer have a connection with their birth family. They don't know who their grandparents were. And that's really, really important for all of us. We all want, you know, there's people are always on these genealogy websites trying to find out who their great-great-grandfather was and stuff like that. We have this driving sense of need to be connected to who came before us, and our aunts and uncles and our cousins, you know, both up and down and to the side. And if you've been in foster care, you don't have that. And so a lot of people are adrift, and Virginia is among the worst for what's called permanency. So permanency means that if a child is in foster care, they ultimately leave foster care to a permanent family. That family could be their original birth family, that's called reunification. It can be their relatives, that's called relative custody. And that happens a lot if their birth parents aren't able to ultimately reunite with them. They might go to live with an aunt and uncle or a grandparent, and that grandparent and relative might take custody, legal custody of them, or adoption. Virginia has always been, as long as I've done this work and way before that, has always been the bottom for permanency. Wow. We've usually been either the very bottom or 3 from the bottom in terms of finding permanency. And what that means is that children who never find permanency age out of foster care. Mm-hmm. And so we have the highest rate of children who age out of foster care, and that means they become an adult and they don't have any roots. They have nothing. Right. And I have a child, he's 25, and he calls me for advice. He comes home for Thanksgiving and Christmas. The connection, even though he lives halfway across the country, is very strong. And so if I wasn't there, he would not have someone to call up and say, hey, I've been, made this job offer, what do I do? Or I'm thinking about buying a car, what should I do? There's none of that connection. There's no, oh, my heart is broken because, somebody broke up with me, hold my hand. There's no one there for that. And so when kids age out of foster care, then they have a lot of homelessness. They're much more likely to be homeless. In fact, a huge proportion of the homeless population was once in foster care. Wow. They're more likely to enter into the criminal justice system, more likely to become pregnant as teenagers. Only 3% of kids who have been in foster care complete a 4-year degree. So we are really, we're doing what we think will help kids, and actually we make their lives worse.
Wow. And
that's really hard. And when we remove children from their parents, it's really traumatic to them. And there have been study after study. There was a study in Finland of children who were removed from their families in Finland and sent to live somewhere else so they'd be safe if Finland was invaded. And those children, decades later, as elderly adults, showed brain changes in their brains that were different from children whose parents didn't send them to live in safety. Wow. And those children were more likely as adults to have alcoholism and drug dependency issues because of the trauma of being separated from their birth parent. It is extremely traumatic. there are two places. DC is one, and New York City or the state of New York is another, where before a judge will grant a department's request to remove a child from their family, they have to show that the harm of staying with this parent is greater than the harm of removing them. Virginia is not one of those states. So we tend to tell ourselves that we're helping kids when we remove them, but often, just like I said, with that child, youth who was in foster care, and said, if only they had given my mom the money that they gave my foster parents, I could have stayed at home.
It's so interesting, like this entire foster care or narrative or example that you are sharing is exactly my father's experience. My father was a foster child. He was born in Washington, D.C. The only thing that he knows that he's been told about his mother is that she was 15 when she had him. He aged out. It was the foster family that he had was terrible. He met my mother in high school. My mother's mother, my grandmother, felt sorry for him and allowed him to come over to her home that was full of her 9 children. But so my father had a liking toward my mother, and so here I am.
Well, I'm glad of that, at least.
Yes. But because he was in the foster care system, because he aged out and all of, because he was incarcerated and he struggled with drug addiction, and now he's completely turned his life around, which I'm super grateful for. But everything that you're saying, like, I can attest to. There is some, like, my parents experienced this, so it's just amazing to just hear about it from a process or a policy perspective.
Virginia had a report in 2018 that showed some of these structural problems in the foster care system, and we have made some incremental changes which have improved things. One thing that we have not done, and which has been recommended to the General Assembly since 2015, is improve the quality of legal representation provided to parents when their children are removed and put into foster care. And when I first started talking to legislators about this issue, a lot of times they would say, well, why should we pay more for good legal counsel for parents who are so terrible? If they're bad parents, then why should they get good legal counsel? Now, as a lawyer who believes strongly in justice, that of course made my blood boil. But regardless of what you think about due process and fairness and access to justice, regardless of whether you think all of those things are important, and I do, the biggest issue is that in states that have improved the quality of legal services to the parents of children in foster care, the outcomes for the children in foster care improve and faster.
Wow. Please make sure you come right back as we continue our conversation with Valerie LaRue.
Here we are, 2013. We all depend on technology to communicate, to bank, and none of us know how to read and write code.
The first program I wrote asked things like, what's your favorite color? Or how old are you?
I wrote a program to play tic-tac-toe.
I first learned how to make a green circle and a red square appear on the screen.
You're just trying to make something, trying to transfer something from your mind to the computer or to a tablet. It's an experience.
The whole limit in the system is just that there just aren't enough people who are trained and have these skills today.
The programmers of tomorrow are the wizards of the future. You're going to look like you have magic powers compared to everybody else.
Great coders are today's rock stars. That's it.
You've known for years that this is the #1 cause of lung cancer, smoking. That's why the Surgeon General issued this warning. But do you know the #1 cause of lung cancer for non-smokers? It's in this room. You can't see it or smell it. It's radon. Radon is an invisible radioactive gas that seeps inside your home from underground. It can build up to dangerous levels without notice. Now the Surgeon General has issued another lung cancer warning. And whether you smoke or not, breathing radon can cause lung cancer. That's why you need to have your home tested. Protect your family. Call 1-800-SOS-RADON. Heed the warning. Have your home tested, because radon problems can be fixed.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
And thank you so much for joining us back on Inside Scoop with our conversation with Valerie LaRose. From the last segment, she had us on a cliffhanger, so I'm going to ask her to pick up right where she left off. We were talking about the importance of legal representation for parents that are in like the foster care system. Why is that so important? And what decision was made within our Virginia General Assembly?
Yeah, so Virginia has the lowest rate of compensation for attorneys who represent parents in what's called child dependency proceedings. That means children who are dependent on the state. They're in their wards of the state, basically. So that's children in foster care. We pay those attorneys a flat fee of $120. Now here in Fairfax, I'm sure that most attorneys—
$120 an hour?
Flat fee.
A day?
Not a day.
For the duration of the case, $120?
Yes. Now this is $120 per petition filed. And so a petition sometimes could be one hearing, but a lot of times it can be 3 hearings. So here in Fairfax, I expect a lot of the attorneys probably charge like $350 an hour, $400 an hour. So you can imagine how much time $120 pays for.
Yeah.
At the court-appointed rate, which is supposed to be $90 an hour, that's basically an hour and a third, which might cover 1 court hearing. What it doesn't really cover is time to meet with the client, time to file motions, time to subpoena witnesses, time to investigate the evidence. And so the quality of the legal representation that parents get when their children are in foster care is pretty limited due to that. Not only that, but because it's so low, and this is really happening very strongly here in Northern Virginia, where there are tons of attorneys are not taking these cases because you can't really live in Northern Virginia and get paid that little.
Right.
And so all across Virginia, whether it's here in Fairfax or whether it's far southwest Virginia, it's getting harder and harder for judges to find attorneys to take these cases. But also we don't have real training standards, we don't have practice standards, we don't have real certification for parents to represent, attorneys to represent parents in these matters. So that was a problem that was recognized and studied in 2014 by the Virginia Commission on Youth. So they took notice of the fact that there have been more and more studies from other states showing that improved legal counsel leads to better outcomes for children in foster care. So in 2014, the General Assembly, or the Virginia Commission on Youth, had this study. They made a recommendation. The recommendation was to allow parents' attorneys to ask for an additional $120 if they went above and beyond in their case. And 2 of your Northern Virginia legislators carried that legislation, Delegate Keene, who's no longer in the legislation, and Senator Marsden. So they carried that in 2015. The bill relating to that passed, but the funding did not. So it died. Now in 2021, I asked those same legislators if they would carry the bills again. And they said yes, the same legislators. They carried the bills again, and exactly the same thing happened. Now, originally the legislature, the money committees of the legislature, had been in the hands of Republicans, and there's a stereotype that Republicans are tight-fisted, don't want to spend money, and Democrats are kind of free and like to spend money and like to give away all the government's money and tax you and all of that. So I thought, oh well, Democrats are in charge now, they like to give away money, so I bet these things will pass this time. So I asked the legislators to carry them again, they did, and guess what, exactly the same thing happened. So the legislature, even in the control of those free-spending Democrats, was not willing to increase the rate of pay for parents' attorneys from $120 to $240. And in talking to legislators, because that's my job, and that's one of the things we really do at VPLC, is talk to legislators and help them understand why certain issues are so important and how they impact low-income people. And so I talked to legislators to explain why this was important, and some of them got it, but a lot of them didn't. And a lot of them said, well, why should we give good lawyers to these bad parents? And, again, that sort of, as a lawyer, is like, But over the years, and talking to legislators, they're starting to really understand. And one of the things that has helped them to understand are more and more studies coming out of other states showing that when parents have good legal representation, and by good, I don't just mean that their attorneys are paid well, but that they are well trained in the issues, because these are they're long-lasting cases. The cases can last from 1 year, 2 years, sometimes even 3 years. So they go on for a really long time. They're very complicated. They have a lot of complex issues. They have a lot of hearings that are federally and state mandated that have to happen at certain times. And certain things have to happen at them, and then there's things you need to do in between them. So they're much more involved than a lot of other cases, certainly much more involved than a criminal case, for instance. As legislators have started to learn about how in states that have improved the state of legal representation for parents, children have benefited. They find that whether they achieve one of the three allowable permanency goals, whether it's reunification, which means going back to their parents, going to the custody of relatives, or being adopted, all of those three permanency outcomes, that means a child having a permanent family, are achieved faster if the parent has better legal representation. There are a number of reasons for that, and I don't know if we have time to go into that, so I'll skip over that and we can come back to it if you want. And the great thing about that is that Virginia is at the bottom for permanency. We are consistently at the bottom or within 3 from the bottom for permanency rates for children. So children are aging out of foster care without ever achieving permanency. So when you have good legal representation for parents, children achieve that gold standard permanency faster, on average by 4 months. And the other really great thing about that is not only is it so much better for the kids to have that permanent family, but the state saves so much money because foster care is super expensive. We spend over $300 million a year in Virginia on foster care for 5,000 kids. And so we spend about $5,000 a month for each child in foster care on all the things that foster care consists of. And so if you cut that by 4 months, that's, $20,000, $16,000, $20,000, around there per child that you're saving. That money could go to an attorney to achieve a better outcome for those families and for those children. And that is just so important. So one of the legislators, Senator Edwards, became really interested in this issue because he's an attorney and he had gone to court on behalf of a relative who was trying to gain custody, that's one of the permanency outcomes, for a child in foster care. And he was shocked at what happened in the courtroom because he had never done that kind of case before. He saw how difficult it is, how the judges need to have a good attorney in the courtroom to counterbalance the power of the government, basically. This is why this is really a bipartisan issue, because we're talking about the government taking someone's child, and then the person whose child is taken not having adequate legal representation to represent them against this powerful government who has taken their child. And so he saw that and he's like, we need to do something about this. And so he asked the legislature to pass a bill that included a study resolution. And the study was to be done by a work group that was to be convened by the Office of the Children's Ombudsman, which, by the way, you should have him on your show.
Okay.
And to look into the issue of legal representation in child dependency cases. And so the work group worked on it for a year and submitted a report to the General Assembly. And the report included a number of recommendations, and one of those recommendations was to increase the rate of attorney compensation from $120 per petition to $445 per petition, which still isn't a whole lot. That's about 1 hour for a Fairfax attorney, but it's a whole lot more than $120. And that did not pass.
Same reason, funding.
Right, neither the House nor the Senate included that in its budget. It would have been around $11 million additional dollars for parent legal representation, but one thing that Virginia has never done is drawn down federal funds that are available to cover legal representation in child dependency cases. And so Around $3 million could have been available to be drawn down to offset that $11 million increase, so it would have been around $8 million. We didn't do it.
Any
However,
reason why?
No, it wasn't really discussed.
Gosh.
So I don't know. But what did pass was a continuation of that study group, so that we're going to be studying it some more, and an additional study from Senator Creigh Deeds to look at the creation of a state office of parent legal representation. You know, we have a state office of criminal defense legal representation. And some states, like North Carolina, for example, that state office also oversees parent legal representation. Virginia, the Indigent Defense Commission wasn't interested in doing that, and so this study, which is to be done by the National Center for State Courts, is looking at creating a separate office. And some states do have a separate office, and so it's not like that's unheard of. But we're one of a tiny minority of states that does not draw down those federal funds for any kind of legal representation for children in foster care. And you know, it would offset about a quarter of the cost, but that's something. We don't draw down any of it for that. So we have 2 more studies coming up. And so we are incrementally moving the ball forward. We are educating more and more people about the issue and how important it is for children that their parents have good legal counsel. And I have represented parents in these matters. I have won some of the cases. One of them I won in the Virginia Court of Appeals. And so I know exactly what it takes. One of the cases that I won was a circuit court appeal, and the trial itself was 12 hours long. Wow. I also spent the entire night before the trial working on preparing for the trial, and the entire 2 weeks before that preparing for it. Now, I didn't get any compensation from the state for that. I did not submit a voucher. If you're in circuit court, you get $158 instead of $120. But I just did it pro bono. But if I had been paid hourly, you can imagine how many hours that would have been. Yeah. And so I was able to overturn the termination of my client's parental rights. Wow. But it was hard. It was a lot of work. And somebody being paid $158 is basically doing it out of the goodness of their heart, not because they're getting paid for it. And like I said, judges are finding it harder and harder to find attorneys willing to take these cases because they can't do it. You can't do a 12-hour trial for $158. So we're really short shrifting parents, families, and children by not providing good legal representation. Wow. The multidisciplinary model is the gold standard for parent legal representation, and that is practiced in a lot of different states, not in Virginia, but we need to bring that here. Wow.
So it seems like Virginia continues to be in the business of tearing families apart versus putting them back together. We really could stand to improve things. Please make sure you come right back for our last segment on Inside Scoop.
Every day across America, excess food is gathered by a network of good people at local food banks, giving hope to millions of children who struggle with hunger. They've earned their wings, and you can too. Together, we can solve child hunger. Support Feeding America and your local food bank at feedingamerica.org.
Hi, I'm Josh Temple. You might have seen me on TV where I help folks turn their houses into dream homes. But forget construction. Parenting is the toughest job there is. So when you need help or advice, turn to the parenting experts at Boys Town.
I was afraid of that.
Well, guess it's time to get you fixed.
Your pets will start fooling around sooner than you think.
Go on, get out of here!
Accidental litters lead to millions killed in shelters each year. Help prevent more. Fix at month 4.
Food. It nourishes, brings us together, and adds flavor to life. That's why it's important to wash hands, surfaces, and fresh produce. Keep raw meat, poultry, and seafood separate from ready-to-eat foods like fruits and vegetables. And cook to proper temperatures using a food thermometer. Enjoy! And refrigerate leftovers within 2 hours. For more tips on safely preparing foods, visit homefoodssafety.org.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
And thank you so much for coming back and joining us on Inside Scoop as we continue our conversation with Valerie LaRoe, the Deputy Director of the Family Advocacy Center within the Virginia Poverty Law Center. So we're talking about, gosh, you were giving us so much great information about just where Virginia stands from a policy perspective when it comes to helping families in the foster care system, families living in poverty. So we're going to segue a little bit, but I know that you specifically can't speak to this, but I could not help but listen to what you were saying and think about two things. Again, my own family, my father I shared with you, who was a foster child, but also how I was raised by my grandmother. My grandmother was born in 1926. My mom and my father had me very young. So my grandmother, she took over while they continued to grow up. But then when my grandmother got older, there was an aunt that stepped in and just said, hey, Mom, I'll take over. And so she and her husband volunteered to take care of essentially, their niece. And if it wasn't for their contribution, if it wasn't for the access that they had to wealth, which was not common within the Black community, if it wasn't for them reaching back and helping me, it completely changed the trajectory of my life. So I'm really inspired by everything that you were sharing, and I'm inspired to encourage Virginia to do better by its lower income and lower income minority families. But the second thing I couldn't help but think about is just how states and really our country needs to be in a place where people of a certain income and demographic need to be able to live comfortably and safely. And I'm just thinking about what's going on in Florida, just the different policies that are being passed against people who look a certain way and who earn a certain level of income and who come from a certain background. And I just could not imagine the U.S. turning into an extended state of Florida. So just from a policy perspective, it's just really giving me a lot of pause. So going into this segment now, I want to talk about the special initiatives that the Virginia Poverty Law Center is touching right now. And something that you talked about earlier was the Virginia Partnership to encourage responsible lending, predatory lenders. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Predatory lenders really take advantage of people's poverty. So if you are, let's say you have a really limited income and your car breaks down and you spend all your money on getting your car fixed so that you can go to work and keep getting your limited income, now you might not have enough money to cover your rent. And if you don't pay your rent, what's going to happen? You're going to get evicted. And so predatory lenders really just sort of basically prey upon people's desperation in that moment and say, oh, do you need money to pay your rent because you need to get to your next paycheck? Well, we'll lend you the money. And people think, oh, that's so great. And the problem is that they have such incredibly high interest rates that sometimes people will borrow just a few $100s, and in a couple of years they owe tens of thousands of dollars, and they have no way of ever paying that back. So VPLC had for a very, very long time been fighting against laws that favored predatory lenders. And it was a really hard fight because it was really hard for people to understand this. Like, oh, well, if you don't want to be taken advantage of, don't borrow the money. That kind of thing. Right. And if you're in a place of privilege where you can borrow money from your family, let's say, go to a bank and you own a house, you can get equity, borrow equity on your house, those kinds of things. You don't really understand what it means to take out a $500 loan at 20% compounding interest. And so
that's low. The 20%.
Oh yeah, it can get
up to triple-digit interest rates.
Yep. And so we started getting calls from people saying, I've been sending them money every week for 10 years, and I'm not out from under this, and it keeps getting more and more, and what am I going to do? And so we have sued those lenders and gotten people's money back, like I mentioned earlier. And then we've also been fighting in the General Assembly to help legislators understand how important it is to have really strict rules about those kinds of we call them predatory lenders, but other people probably know them as like payday lenders,
Right.
car title lenders,
Mm-hmm.
those kinds of things. And of course, once the internet really became widespread, then we started to have internet lenders who were, sending you emails and having ads when you go online on Facebook and things like that. And that's really hard to regulate because it's not like there's the predatory lender down the street. They're not there, they're somewhere else. Wow. And so it's very hard to regulate. And so passing laws to regulate internet lending has also been one of our priorities. And so we've had our executive director, Jay Spear, that has been a passion of his for many years.
Yeah.
He was a legal aid attorney before coming to VPLC, and so he was going to court on behalf of those people every day. The director of our Center for Economic Justice also has been really focused on predatory lending, and we have a helpline for people who are victims of predatory lending so they can call.
I'm glad you said that. I was going to ask if someone has been the victim or they just had a momentary lapse of reasoning and got one of these payday loans, what can they do? Can they contact VPLC?
Yeah, so if people go to our website, which is vplc.org, they can find all of our helplines. We have an eviction helpline, a predatory loan helpline, we have a senior legal helpline, we have a SNAP helpline if people are having trouble getting SNAP. We also have a SNAP calculator on our website so people can figure out how much SNAP they should get. A lot of times there's just a hard time right now in finding workers, low-wage workers, to do things like work for departments of social services to help people figure out their eligibility for SNAP. And so a lot of times they make mistakes because they're not well trained, so people might not get all the benefits they're entitled to. We have a utility helpline for people whose utility have been cut off, and we have an Enroll Virginia helpline for people who need to get either Medicaid, Medicare, or a health insurance plan under the Affordable Care Act.
Wow.
So yeah, we have people standing by to take your call.
Gosh, 30 people though. I mean, can someone, okay, let's just say someone says, oh my goodness, I could not pay my rent and I took out this predatory loan. It was $500. This was 8 months ago. Now it's $1,800. I'm gonna call the VPLC. What can I expect to experience?
So when you call, we can give people some counseling about, what to do with it. If it's a matter where the predatory lender broke the law, then we can look at connecting them to some kind of class action lawsuit that might be going on, those kinds of things. Sometimes we're able to, negotiate with someone. That's what the utility helpline a lot of times consists of, is negotiating with the utility. Well, what amount of money can this person start paying? What amount might be able to be forgiven so they can get the utilities turned back on, those kinds of things.
Okay. And so let's segue a little bit into another initiative, Learn Your Rights, a guide for youth in foster care. What's that program about?
So that is something we've been doing since about 2008 as we've worked with youth who either are or had been in foster care. We work with a really wonderful program. It's in all the community colleges in Virginia. It's called Great Expectations, and they have coaches in the community colleges who work with youth who are, like I said, either in or transitioning out of foster care to help them to achieve their educational objectives. And that can be really hard without a parent. Again, I have a son, I helped him apply to college, I helped him figure out financial aid, but a kid in foster care doesn't have anyone to help them with all that stuff. So the coach of the Great Expectations programs really helps those youth who are aging out of foster care without a permanent family. But one of the things that they have been doing is also at their graduation ceremony each year is having a program for them to learn some self and system advocacy. And so I have learned so much, and a lot of the bills that I have advocated for have come from the youth who have told me and some of the partners that I work with what it is that they want to see for the youth coming up behind them in foster care.
Wow.
And some of those things are like barriers to getting a driver's license. They can be problems with their credit being ruined before they ever even exit foster care, so that somebody used their identity, and so now their credit is ruined before they've even entered adulthood. There's a lot of different things that they have brought to us as issues. And it's just been so wonderful. I work really closely with Voices for Virginia's Children, and they have a great program for youth to get stipends to learn how to be system advocates, and they actually go to the General Assembly and talk to legislators, and it's just the most amazing thing that you can see.
Great. Okay, so I'm sorry. I know we could go on forever.
Yeah, sorry.
So just to let everyone know how to get in contact with VPLC, what can they do to get in contact with you, to access all the services available for the Virginia Poverty Law Center? What can they do?
Yeah, so we have the website, vplc.org. If somebody wants to contact me, they can certainly email me. That's what I recommend, Valerie at VPLC. We also have Facebook. We're on Twitter. We're on Instagram. There's a lot of different ways that they can get in touch with us, and we're really happy to. If we don't generally go to court with people, and a lot of times people call up and say, "Oh, can you go to court with me and represent me on this matter?" And we don't really do that. What we really do is help give people advice. Some information about their situation, connect them to some resources, but we also learn from what people who call us are going through. That really informs our policy objectives.
Gotcha. This has been it's been heavy, but it's been so good. I know that we're all equipped with great information of what we can do to help Virginia become a better place, Fairfax to become a better place. Actually, one of our studio folks came in and said, "Oh my gosh, Deborah, who are you hosting next week? Can you make it happy?" So we are going to make sure that we end this show on an exciting note. You all know this is my favorite part of the show. It is Would You Rather or Either Or. So we're going to ask Valerie some questions and have her share a little bit about us as we close out the show. So Valerie, would you rather ambition or comfort?
Do I have to choose?
You have to choose.
Well, at this stage in my life, I think I would probably say comfort.
Comfort, okay. 50s or 80s music?
Well, again, I like both, but 80s music is so danceable, so I probably have to say 80s.
Do you have a favorite 80s artist?
I'd have a really hard time choosing between Cyndi Lauper and Prince, I think.
Cyndi Lauper and Prince, that is quite a combination. Okay, tattoos or piercings?
Both.
Okay, I'm not going to make you choose on that one. Okay, loud neighbors or nosy neighbors?
Ugh. Well, I have really loud neighbors, some of them because I live in a neighborhood that has a lot of students that sometimes can be very loud.
Yeah.
But I think I would probably prefer that to nosy neighbors even so.
Gotcha. I live next to a high school, and I would much rather nosy neighbors so they can let you know what's going on with your car, if someone's on your property that shouldn't be there. Okay, growth or security?
You mean personally?
Yes.
I don't know. Well, being secure is important, but sometimes you have to grow in order to become secure. So
sounds good. Thank you so much for joining us on Inside Scoop. We'll see you next week, and have a great evening.